Wyoming Territory, August 1873, the sky cracked open with thunder as Penelope Zeller stumbled down the muddy trail, her face streaked with tears and prairie dust. She had not stopped crying since the town council of Dry Willow sent her away that morning. The words still rang in her ears. "You make the other women nervous," one of the matrons had said. "It is unnatural for a widow to grieve this long. We need strong wives and strong mothers, not this display." Penelope had not begged, she had not screamed. She had only cried harder, clutching the locket of her late husband and walking away with a canvas satchel and a heart that felt like cracked glass. The wind pressed against her as she climbed a ridge just before sundown. That was when she saw the light, a faint flicker from a campfire tucked between cottonwoods at the edge of a creek. She hesitated, then stepped closer. The man beside the fire looked up. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his brown hair messy under a weather-worn hat. His coat was patched at the elbows, boots caked in trail dust. He looked about 30, same as her. He stood slowly, eyes narrowing but not unkind. "You lost?" he asked. Penelope didn't answer. Her throat was thick with tears again. He stepped forward. "You hurt?" She shook her head. "No. Not hurt, just, I do not know where to go." He studied her face for a long moment. "You can sit," he said, nodding to the fire. "No questions, just the fire." She dropped her satchel and sank onto a log, her hands trembling. He poured coffee from a tin pot and handed her a cup without a word. They sat in silence, the fire snapping between them. Then, as the night deepened, her tears came again, slow at first, then shaking her shoulders. She pressed the cup to her chest like it might hold her together. "I am sorry," she whispered. "I cry too much." The man looked at her, really looked. "You do not have to be strong here," he said quietly. That broke something. Penelope cried until her ribs ached, and he said nothing more, only tossed another log on the fire and kept watch, as if it were the most natural thing in the world to sit beside a woman who had been banished for grieving. When she finally slept, her head fell against her satchel. The man gently pulled his coat from his shoulders and laid it over her. His name was Fletcher Jameson, and he had not planned on company. He had been on his way to Fort Laramie with a few crates of saddles and tools he had crafted himself back in his workshop near Medicine Bow. He lived alone, by choice, after losing his younger brother to a mining accident 3 years earlier. Since then, he had taken to the trail when the silence grew too loud. But something in Penelope's face, the rawness, the way she tried to hold her tears back even when they spilled, it reached into something he had buried. At dawn, she woke to him boiling beans and slicing hardtack. "I should go," she said, voice hoarse. "I have no place, but I will find one." "Where will you go?" he asked. She hesitated. "I do not know." "Then come with me," he said without looking up. "If you want." Penelope blinked. "I am not trying to rescue you," he added. "But you do not look like you should be alone." She stared at him. "Why would you do that?" He shrugged. "Sometimes a trail's easier with company." Her fingers curled around the locket at her neck. She thought of Dry Willow, the cold stairs, the whispers behind closed doors. Her husband had only been dead a year. She had loved him truly, but the grief had broken something inside her. The town had not known what to do with a woman who could not stop feeling. "All right," she said at last. That day they rode side by side, her on a borrowed mule he had named Daisy, him on a tall roan gelding named Flint. They said little. She did not know what to talk about, and he did not press her. At midday, he handed her a strip of dried venison. "You do not talk much," she said quietly. He chewed, then glanced at her. "Never saw much point in saying what you do not mean," she nodded. "That is fair." The second night they camped in a hollow near a stream. Penelope washed her hands and face in the cold water, then sat near the fire watching the stars. "When my husband died," she said, "I felt like the world had stopped, but everyone else kept moving and they expected me to move too." Fletcher nodded slowly. "People are afraid of sadness, makes them feel close to it." "I tried to stop crying," she said, "but it kept coming. Like it had nowhere else to go." His voice was low. "You're allowed to feel." She turned to him, eyes shadowed by firelight. "Why are you kind to me?" He looked into the flames for a long time. "Because someone should have been kind to you sooner," her breath caught. That night she did not cry. Not because the grief was gone, but because something else had settled beside it, something quiet and warm. Over the next few days, they made their way along the trail. Fletcher showed her how to stack kindling, how to read the clouds for storms. She told him stories from her childhood growing up near the Big Horn River, her father's fiddle, the way her mother used to braid her hair tight enough to make her eyes water. He listened. Always listened. One afternoon, as they crossed a shallow creek, her mule slipped. Penelope yelped, grabbing the saddle horn as Daisy stumbled. Fletcher was beside her in a flash, his hand steadying her leg. "You all right?" She nodded, breathless. His hand lingered just a second longer than it needed to. Then he stepped back. "That night under a cottonwood tree," she said softly, "I think I forgot what safety felt like." His voice was gentle. "Then maybe it is time you remembered." She looked at him, heart pounding. "Why do you care?" He met her gaze. "Because I see you." Her eyes filled again, but this time it was different. She did not look away. She whispered, "I see you too." And for the first time in a long, long while, the tears came with a smile. By the time they reached the southern edge of the Laramie Plains, a hush had settled between them, not cold, not awkward, just the kind that grew from easy company. The trail had turned flatter, the land stretching wide and open around them, sun-bleached and wind-worn. Antelope sometimes watched from a distance, ears flicking, their bodies still as stone. Fletcher reined in near a grove where cottonwoods leaned over a slow bend in the river. "We'll camp here tonight." Water's clean and the ground soft enough to sleep decent. Penelope dismounted, her legs sore from the day's ride. She brushed a strand of hair out of her eyes and led Daisy to the water's edge, her steps slower than usual. Fletcher noticed. "Something wrong with your foot," she nodded once. "Stirrup leather rubbed raw against my ankle. I didn't notice until we stopped." "Let me see." She hesitated, but sat on a fallen log and tugged off her boot. Fletcher crouched beside her, careful not to touch without asking, "You mind?" "No." He moved the hem of her stocking gently. A patch of skin was rubbed raw, red and broken in the middle. "You'll need to keep this clean. I have salve in my saddlebag." She looked past him to where the river caught the evening light. "You know a fair bit about mending things." He stood, brushing dust from his trousers. "Spent most of my life fixing what folks throw away." When he returned with the tin, he knelt again and dabbed a bit of the thick, pine-scented balm onto her skin. Penelope watched the side of his face, the way his brow creased in concentration. There was something careful about his touch, not hesitant, but full of respect. "I used to tend my husband's hands after he came in from the fields," she said softly. "He'd get blisters along his palms from the scythe. He never asked, but I always had the oil ready." Fletcher didn't look up. "That sounds like love, the kind that grows quiet." It was. He finished and helped her gently replace the boot without another word. As the sun dipped low, they built a fire. Penelope peeled an onion and sliced it into a skillet while Fletcher unpacked a small sack of beans and a strip of salt pork. As the food cooked, she asked, "Do you always travel with a skillet?" "Only when I plan on eating." She laughed, a soft, surprised sound. He smiled into the fire. Later, after supper, she walked barefoot down to the river. The water was cold, but she let it run around her ankles anyway, the current tugging at her hem. Fletcher came down with a coil of rope and began checking Flint's hooves nearby. "Did you ever think about marrying?" she asked, her voice barely above the hush of the river. He glanced over but didn't stop working. "I did." "What happened?" "She married someone else." I was too slow to speak, and he had land. Penelope stepped closer to where the river shallowed against a bed of smooth stones. "Do you miss her?" "No, I miss the idea of her, but that's different." She nodded, then bent to pick up a rounded stone, cool and slick in her palm. "I used to think grief faded like bruises, but it's more like a scar beneath your clothes. You forget it's there, until something presses against it." Fletcher tied the rope loosely around Flint's front foot, then stood. "You've got a way of saying things that stick." She turned to face him. "Would it trouble you if I stayed longer than Laramie?" "No," he said. "It wouldn't trouble me at all." The frogs had begun to hum in the reeds, and somewhere a night bird called long and low. She crossed to him, the wet stones cold under her steps. "I don't want to be a burden," she said. "You're not." I don't know what I can offer, he met her eyes. You already have. The space between them changed, then nothing sudden, just a shift like wind turning a weather vane. She didn't need to ask what he meant, she knew, and when she stepped closer, he didn't move away. She said, I'm tired of pretending. You don't have to. The moon climbed higher, silvering the water and the edges of their faces. They stood like that, quiet, the river running behind them, the firelight flickering through the trees. And then, without ceremony or warning, she leaned in and pressed her forehead gently against his chest. He wrapped his arms around her, not to hold her still, but to let her rest. Neither of them spoke again that night. They didn't need to. The wind shifted on the morning they crossed into the foothills west of Laramie, carrying with it the scent of pine and damp earth. Fletcher paused on a narrow rise, letting Flint drink from a shallow puddle while his eyes scanned the horizon. When Penelope caught up, her skirt hem dusted with needles, she followed his gaze. You waiting on something? She asked, her voice lower now, steadier in a way it hadn't been when they first met. He shook his head. Just remembering. My brother used to trap in these hills. Kept a lean-to up near a bluff with a lightning-split pine. I haven't been back since. She didn't ask what happened. She already knew enough to understand the silence that followed. They rode on without speaking, the path narrowing between boulders and low brush until finally they reached a clearing where the sun broke open the treetops. Fletcher dismounted and led Flint to a flat stretch near a fallen log. Penelope followed suit, rubbing Daisy's neck before loosening the cinch. I can gather kindling, she offered. Look for dry alder, burns longer. As she wandered into the trees, she ran her hand along the edge of her shawl, her thoughts quiet. She'd begun to notice things she hadn't before: the way Fletcher always checked the sky before making camp, how he whistled softly under his breath when he worked, how he gave her space without ever seeming distant. When she returned, arms full of dry branches, he was laying out a tin of oats and a wedge of aged cheese. She knelt beside him and set down the wood. I've been thinking, he said, not looking up, about building a cabin again. Penelope brushed bark from her skirt. Where? South of Medicine Bow. There's land near the ridge that doesn't flood and gets early sun in spring. I've got deeds to 2 parcels, she glanced at him. You thinking of going back to town? Just close enough to trade, far enough to breathe, she hesitated. Would you want company there? His hands stilled. If the company wanted to stay, she looked into the branches above. I never thought I'd want a home again, but I don't feel lost with you. He reached for a tin cup and poured water into it, then passed it to her. Then maybe we build something together, doesn't have to look like what came before. She took a sip, the water cool on her tongue. I never learned to plant anything, not really. My husband did most of that. I can teach you. She smiled faintly. You teach quiet. Like you're planting a thought and waiting to see if it takes root. He gave a soft breath through his nose. You listen like you're gathering pieces, like you're trying to carry what others drop. She turned toward him. Fletcher, do you ever wish things had happened different, only if it means I wouldn't have met you? The air between them went still, then he said, I don't want to speak too soon, you're not, he nodded once. Then I'll say it plain, I want you beside me, not just on the trail. In the mornings and the winters, in the quiet weeks and the hard ones, her voice trembled but it didn't break, I want that too. They didn't kiss, not then. Instead, she leaned her head against his shoulder and he rested his cheek against her hair. The sun slipped behind the trees, and in the hush that followed, they stayed like that 2 people who had been torn open by different griefs, choosing, slowly and completely, to begin again. That night she rolled her bedroll nearer his, close enough to hear his breathing deepen as the fire settled to embers. Under the stars, she whispered, Thank you for seeing me. His hand found hers beneath the blanket. You're not something to fix, he said. You're someone to hold. And for the first time since leaving Dry Willow, Penelope slept without dreaming of the past. They reached the edge of Fletcher's land under a sky the color of cooled iron, with a light wind pushing across the prairie grass as if urging them forward. The trail had narrowed between 2 low ridges, the kind that caught snow early and held it late. Penelope rode quiet, her eyes following the slope of the land, taking in the long stretch of open space and the grove of ash trees he'd spoken of once the night before had turned cold. Fletcher dismounted first. "We'll clear near the rise, soil's better there." Penelope slid from Daisy's back, boots crunching over dry stalks. "You've thought this through?" "I've had time." They walked together toward a patch of earth where the grass grew thin and the wind carried the smell of sage. Fletcher crouched, pressing his hand against the dirt. Penelope stood beside him, arms folded against the breeze. "What are you feeling for?" she asked. "Drainage," he said. "And if the ground's too loose, this'll hold." She knelt beside him, pressing her own palm into the soil. It was cool and firm, and she imagined a floor here, a hearthstone, a door that stayed closed when she wanted it to. The thought made her chest ache, not with sadness but with something steadier. "How soon will you start building?" she asked. "When the frost lifts from the mornings. That gives us time to mark the frame and cut what we'll need." She looked toward the trees. He met her gaze. "I don't want to build it alone." Penelope didn't answer right away. She walked a few paces toward the ash grove, then turned. "I'd like to plant something at the edge, not for food, just something that blooms." His mouth turned up, not in amusement, but in something closer to wonder. "What kind?" "I don't know yet. Just something soft." They pitched camp near the edge of the grove. While Fletcher sharpened his drawknife along a whetstone, Penelope unpacked the cloth bundle of dry beans and a tin of salt. She poured the beans into a kettle and added water from the nearby stream, setting it over the fire. Her hands moved without hesitation now, steady and practiced. "You ever think about teaching?" Fletcher asked, slicing thin curls from a split log. She raised an eyebrow. "Teaching? You watch close. Could be horses, cooking, doesn't matter. You make things easier to understand. I never thought of myself that way." "Well, you are." She stirred the beans, her voice quieter now. "I used to make up lessons for my younger sister. She couldn't sit still, so I'd turn everything into a story, even math." "What happened to her?" "She married a cattleman and moved near Cheyenne. We haven't spoken since my husband passed. I think it frightened her." Fletcher set the knife down. "Loss changes the way people look at you." Penelope nodded. "Sometimes they stop looking altogether." The beans began to simmer, a faint hiss rising with the steam. She added a pinch of salt, then leaned back on her heels. "I don't want to be remembered by what I've lost," she said. "I want to be seen for what I keep." Fletcher stood and crossed to the fire. He didn't sit. He looked down at her, his voice low. "Then let's build something that remembers who you are now." She looked up at him, her throat tight. "You make it sound simple." "It won't be," he said. "But it'll be honest." They ate together on a blanket laid over the flattened grass. The beans were plain but warm, and the silence between bites felt full with the kind of comfort neither had known in a long time. As the stars came out, Penelope reached into her satchel and pulled out a folded scrap of paper, the edges worn soft. She handed it to him without a word. He unfolded it carefully. It was a sketch, done in charcoal, of a small cabin with smoke curling from the chimney and a fenced garden in bloom. A woman stood by the door, one hand resting against its frame. "I drew it after the first time you mentioned this place," she said. "Didn't know if I'd ever show you." Fletcher studied the drawing with quiet reverence. "This looks like home," she swallowed. "I think it could be." He looked at her then, and she saw something in his expression that hadn't been there before, something certain. He reached for her hand, his fingers rough and warm around hers. "I want you here, Penelope, not just for the building or the spring." "For all of it," she didn't hesitate. "Then I'm staying." No wind stirred the grass, no sound but the fire's soft pop. Fletcher leaned in, his forehead resting gently against hers, like a promise made without needing to be spoken. Her eyes closed, and in the hush between them, something took root stronger than grief, steadier than fear. When she opened her eyes again, she smiled. And this time, she wasn't crying. The first snow came early that year, drifting in from the high country before the trees had dropped all their leaves. Fletcher stood beneath the unfinished rafters of the cabin, tapping a chisel along the edge of a fitted beam, his breath rising in pale clouds. Penelope watched from the slope where she was stacking split kindling against the windward side, her cheeks flushed from the cold. "How long before the roof's on?" she asked, brushing sawdust from her sleeves. By week's end, if the weather holds, Fletcher said, stepping back to inspect the join. Once the ridge is set, we'll have shelter before the deep frost. I'll start lining the inside walls with muslin. I brought rolls from the wagon. He lowered the chisel and glanced at her hands. You've been working them stiff. I like the ache. It reminds me I'm building something that's mine. She turned toward the slope, the bundle of kindling balanced against her hip. Fletcher watched her walk, her stride sure now, her eyes no longer looking past everything she touched. She had stopped asking permission to belong. That night, the wind picked up, rattling the lean to where they still slept while the cabin stood half-raised a few yards away. Penelope tucked her shawl under her chin and leaned into Fletcher's side as the fire cracked low. His arm curled around her shoulders, drawing her close without a word. "You ever think about what comes after it's all built?" she said quietly. He nodded once. "I do." "What does it look like?" He waited a moment before answering. "Waking warm, a garden that needs tending. A place where no one gets sent away for feeling too much." Penelope laid her head against his chest. "I want to sew curtains for the window. I want color in the house, not just wood and wool. You'll have it. I want a table that seats more than two." He looked down at her. "Planning for company, for family." His hand stilled on her shoulder. "You mean children? If they come, we'll raise them. If not, we'll still have a full table." He let out a slow breath. "You sure this is what you want?" She didn't hesitate. "Yes, I want the cold mornings and the long work. I want the days when we don't speak much and the ones when we talk until the fire dies. I want all of it, Fletcher, with you." He leaned forward, pressing his lips to her forehead, then down to her temple, his voice low against her skin. "Then it's yours." All of it. By the time the roof was finished, the snow had thickened. They spent a full day sealing the cracks between the logs with mud and straw, Penelope's gloves soaked through by midday, but she didn't stop. Fletcher worked beside her, his movements steady, the rhythm of his hands keeping time with hers. Inside, the cabin smelled of pine and ash. Penelope unfolded a quilt she had kept packed tightly since her wedding, one she had stitched with her mother in the years before marriage. She laid it across the bed frame Fletcher had built from spruce and smiled when he ran his hand along the rail, not to check the craftsmanship, but to feel the warmth of something shared. The first night beneath their roof, they cooked in the hearth on a cast iron hook Fletcher had installed that afternoon. Penelope stirred lentils and wild onion into a pot while Fletcher stacked books along a handmade shelf in the corner. "I didn't realize you read so much," she said, watching him run his thumb along a leather-bound spine. "My brother used to read to me. I kept his copies." She crossed the room and traced the edge of a worn cover. "You've carried him with you?" "Same way you carry your husband's memory," he said gently. She nodded. "But it doesn't weigh like it used to, not since I met you." When the meal was done, they sat on the floor before the fire, legs stretched out, mugs of cider warming their hands. Outside, the snow fell soundlessly, smothering the prairie in white. "I want to be married," Penelope said suddenly, her voice clear, not rushed. "Not because I need it, because I choose it." Fletcher turned toward her, his eyes steady. "You want vows?" "I do." He reached for her hand and held it, strong and certain. "Then I give you mine. I'll keep you warm. I'll build with you. I'll never turn away from your sorrow or your joy." She smiled, tears pricking at the corners of her eyes. "And I'll stand beside you even when the trail's hard. I'll carry what we build. I'll laugh when you're quiet and listen when you speak." They kissed then, slow and sure, not new lovers but choosing ones. The warmth between them was no longer fragile. It had roots. Spring came late that year, but when it did, the ground softened enough for Penelope to plant. She chose marigold and bee balm and planted them in a crooked line along the eastern wall. Fletcher built her a bench beneath the window and surprised her with a carved wooden box filled with seed packets he'd bartered for in Laramie. When the flowers bloomed, they filled the air with color and scent, and Fletcher would sit beside her in the evenings, watching the light shift across the prairie. They never returned to Dry Willow. They didn't need to. Years passed. The garden grew. In time, a cradle stood near the hearth, carved by Fletcher's hands, its blanket stitched by Penelope's. Their home became a place where others came for warmth, for stories, for rest. No one was turned away. No one was asked to leave their grief at the door. They lived long and they lived well. Not perfectly, but with honesty and care. And every morning when Penelope opened her eyes and found Fletcher beside her, she remembered the first thing he ever said, "You don't have to be strong here." She never forgot it, and she was never alone again.